All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at the Houthis, that pesky group down in Yemen that continues to fire drones and missiles at just about everything that's in range. So we're going to talk about the impact that these attacks are having on international shipping, the recently expanded target list that the Houthis now say they're going after, and why the United States isn't responding in force. Now, before getting started, I think it's worth bringing up a little bit of background to help contextualize what we're getting into here. For starters, the Houthis are just a group inside of Yemen. There is still the Republic of Yemen, the internationally recognized entity in that country. They've been in the middle of an ongoing civil war for going on around 10 years now, and it's, by all measures, pretty underreported. You're talking about 377,000 people have been killed in this civil war, with 4 million more displaced, and it's just war crimes are kind of the language they speak. It is nonstop from really both sides. When we're looking at the Houthis specifically, we're talking about torture, raping female prisoners to purify them before moving them into the sex trade. Countless children, tens of thousands of children who have been abducted from their homes, sent to military and ideological training camps where they're, of course, not paid, beaten, tortured, and then sent off to the front where they die. Talking about kids as young as 10. Some of these kids so indoctrinated that when they end up with these military forces at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, they're reporting their families, their parents, for being non-believers. So it's, at baseline, pretty rough situation in Yemen across the board. And the Houthis, over the past few years, have kind of solidified their control in the western portion of the country. The Houthis have a lot of backing from the Iranians, which is going to play a major portion as we get into kind of discussing the nature of these attacks and why the United States isn't necessarily responding the way some people think that we should. Conversely, the Republic of Yemen has the backing directly of Saudi Arabia and indirectly the United States. There's a lot of foreign entities at play directly or indirectly in this Yemen civil war that, fortunately, in recent months has kind of reached a bit of a stalemate. Peace talks are ongoing. That too is going to play into one of the reasons as to why the United States is not taking more deliberate action. Now, the Houthis began these series of attacks on commercial, really focused on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in November. This was just as the war in Gaza, the air war had been going on for a few weeks, and the ground invasion was starting to take shape. So the Houthis stepped forward and said their contribution to stand in support of the Palestinian people would be to target any commercial vessels associated with Israel, the United States, or the United Kingdom until, and they say this in every single one of their attacks they carry out, until the siege of Gaza is lifted and humanitarian aid is allowed to flow into the Palestinian people. They've been very, very consistent with the reasoning as to why they're carrying out these attacks. Now, there's a real argument to be had here as to whether or not, if the war in Gaza stops, will the Houthi attacks actually stop? We have a little bit of evidence to suggest they would, based off of previous ceasefires. During ceasefires between Hamas and Israel since this war began, the Houthis did stop their attacks during that time period. I believe there were a couple of Houthi drones shot down, but it's not clear if those are actually attack drones or if there's the United States and our allies in the region preemptively shooting down what could have been reconnaissance drones. A major issue here worth considering, however, is will the Houthis take away from this experience that they have a new means of kind of exerting pressure and applying pressure to get something that they want, right? So in this case, even if the war in Gaza were to stop, the lesson the Houthis might learn from this whole experience at this point is they have the means to inflict pain upon the United States, the United Kingdom, Israel, really the entire global economy, to shape some sort of decision in their favor. That's something we have to keep in mind as they're carrying out these attacks. Is it the type of behavior that we want to allow to continue, where they can just kick it off again 3, 4, 5 years down the road if there's something else where they really want to get someone's attention? Now, originally, the Houthis said that they were only targeting ships that were associated with the United States, United Kingdom, or Israel. We're going to get more into that in the second portion here, looking at the targeting criteria, but that is really changed quite a bit. Now, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, put out a great report recently that's worth running through, highlighting the economic impacts to international shipping. And for all the trolls out there that say I work for the DIA or get paid by the DIA, I can tell you if I did or had any insight or any in with the DIA, I would push them to put out more of these reports than they are. There's like one of these coming out every couple months at best, and they're short and full of really good information. So if I had, if the DIA comes forward with that non-existent contract for YouTubers or influencers or whatever, I would use that to push forward. One of my bullet points would be you got to put more of these documents together. It's really good information. And I'll link this in the description below. So this specific DIA report was getting into the economic implications of these Houthi attacks from November 2023, when they started, until March of 2024. So another, I wish it was up until this week, but they cut it off in March of 2024, which is going to be important because they changed their targeting criteria in May. So this window we're looking at, November to March, was when the Houthis were saying that they were only targeting US, UK, or Israeli ships. It's not exactly how it played out. But anyways, in that report, they said container shipping through the Red Sea has declined by approximately 90% since December. They say alternate shipping routes around Africa add about 11,000 nautical miles, 1 to 2 weeks of transit time, and approximately $1 million in fuel costs for each voyage. This is the alternate route that ships are choosing to take instead of risking running through the Gulf of Aden or the Red Sea, where the Houthis might decide, who knows, maybe they're having a bad day and they're going to sling a drone off in their general direction. They say for shipping companies, the combined costs of crew bonuses, war risk insurance, which is roughly 1,000% more than pre-war costs, and Suez transit fees make the additional time and financial costs traveling around Africa less expensive by comparison. They say as of February, humanitarian relief for Sudan and Yemen is being delayed by weeks and costing aid organizations quite a bit more because of longer travel routes around Africa. So one thing I see referenced a lot when looking at the impact the Houthis are having to the international shipping, international economy, is people saying, well, it doesn't really impact me. And right now, if you're in the United States or portions of Europe, that's generally true. We haven't really seen these costs directly tie into an increase in our cost of living. From my understanding at this point, it's largely been contained to portions of Europe, Africa, or other portions of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. But we have a global economy, right? This is international shipping. And over time, these costs, if the shipping costs for one area start to go up, they start to go up across the board for these shipping companies. And before long, you will feel this impact in one way or another. But something that does not get brought up enough, in my opinion, is this last bullet point where they said that humanitarian aid is also trying to travel through some of these corridors, some of it set for Yemen, the country that has lost 377,000 people due to a war and a famine over the last 10 years. Some of this aid isn't getting through to Yemen, to their own people. And then, of course, other aid trying to get to Africa. And they're having to travel a long way around, adding significant cost and delays. You have to think that in some of these humanitarian conditions, them not getting the aid for an extra couple weeks could very well be costing additional lives. Now, one thing that some of these crews started doing to try to signal to the Houthis, hey, we are not part of this criteria. We're not Americans. We're not British. We're not Israeli, is they started broadcasting across their networks saying things like, we have no links to Israel, or because some ships were still trying to make this work, which is why some ships were still being attacked. They had at times sending off messages saying all Syrian crew or China ship crew. One vessel even was carrying, they signaled out they were carrying Russian crude oil to try to tell the Houthis, like, don't hit us. We're just innocent. We're trying to get through here. Of course, that one didn't work either. That actual ship carrying Russian crude oil was attacked by the Houthis while it was bound for China, of all places. Now, getting into some of these specific attacks here, this is data that's kind of hard to parse, really, because there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this. On the high side, we're looking at around 190 total attacks carried out by the Houthis against military and commercial vessels since November. That number is coming from the U.S. Department of Defense. But there's a lot of different ways to look at this. The DoD regularly intercepts or engages, I should say, missiles that are being staged to launch or drones getting ready to launch into the Red Sea. That's an attack about to happen, and it's probably worth counting that, because if the U.S. or our allies hadn't done anything, that attack would have played out. So that number is being counted, but then we have other munitions that are intercepted. That's an attack. Sometimes they miss their target. There's been multiple reports where the Houthis say they conducted an attack on a ship, and the ship says, we have no idea what they're talking about. And the U.S. will later say, it looks like there might have been 2 missiles that impacted about 20 kilometers away from one of these ships. The ship didn't even see it. That's also, an attempted attack, maybe is the terminology we should be using here. Also, in some of these attacks, you're seeing one drone or one unmanned surface vessel or one missile. And other times it's 3 to 5 munitions fired at once. So, when you're hearing the number of attacks, number of times ships are targeted, there's a lot of variation in that data. And you're going to see that as we get through this video here. Now, again, originally the Houthis said that they were only targeting ships that belonged to, were operated by, flagged, or were going to and from ports in the United States, United Kingdom, or Israel. So that was the connection. The US, UK, and Israel had to own the ship, operate the ship, or the ship had to be traveling to and from a port from those countries. It's hard to say if that was actually the Houthis' goal or if that's just what they said to cover the actions they were carrying out, because it didn't really play out that way. And sometimes I saw that expanded out to say there was somebody on the board of directors of the company that owns this ship who is an Israeli citizen or has dual Israeli citizenship. That feels a lot more like after the fact, trying to justify why a ship was actually targeted. So it's hard to say definitively if that was the Houthis' goal and their intelligence, real-time intelligence of kind of what they were targeting was really that bad, or if that was just kind of a loose cover to allow them to target essentially anyone moving near their coastline. Now, I do want to pull up an interesting resource here that I'll also link in the description below. This is called the ArcGIS Story Maps. It was created and maintained by the Washington Institute, a U.S.-based think tank, and they have a breakdown of all of the different attacks that the Houthis have carried out. You can go back earlier, all the way to 2019, but you can see, we can break this down. We've got the merchant ship attacks, and it'll give an explanation of each one of these, where the attack took place, who was hit, how they were hit, and then warship attacks as well. Same thing. So breaking it down into the location it took place. Most of these announcements on the military side are coming from CENTCOM, but pretty cool tool to see exactly where all of these different attacks are taking place in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So again, I'll link this in the description below, but a lot of what we're focused on here today are the merchant ships that have been hit in this area. So looking over this data presented by the U.S. Department, presented by DIA, they mapped 43 total merchant ships that were targeted during that period from November until March of 2024. Only 16 of those 43 meet the criteria laid out by the Houthis. So 16 of 43 are actually what the Houthis said they were targeting. Less than half, right? So of those 16, 7 of those ships were linked to the United Kingdom. Again, linked being flagged, operated, owned, traveling to the UK or from the UK. 7 of 16 were linked to the UK. 1 was linked to Israel. It was a ship traveling to Israel. And 8 were linked to the United States. So 16 out of 43 total, according to the initial Houthi criteria. Also worth mentioning, I brought this up earlier, 1 ship was full of Russian oil, was traveling from the Black Sea to China. That was struck by the Houthis. And then there was 1 Chinese-owned ship also struck. It doesn't appear that one was connected also to the US, UK, or Israel. So look, at baseline, this original data showing the ships that were hit here, it's hard to say that the Houthis actually were abiding by that targeting criteria. They were just kind of shooting everybody that came by. It's kind of what that looks like, right? Now, it's worth mentioning that in May, right when the Israeli offensive into Rafah started to kick off, that was essentially another red line for a lot of Hamas's allies around the region. We've seen a few so far in this war. One was when Israel actually put boots on the ground and began moving into Gaza. Another big one, I think there was one around Shifa. Some entities put out some information about Shifa. If Israel goes into Shifa, we'll do this or that. The most recent was around Israel moving troops into the southern enclave of Rafah. And when that happened, just a couple days after Israel moved in, the Houthis put out a statement saying, quote, "We will seek to strengthen the 4th stage of escalation in terms of the number of attacks and the impact of strikes." And what that appears to have meant, in kind of parsing through the data here, is they're going to strike anybody. So the 4th stage of escalation, kind of the way to interpret that, is that the Houthis are now targeting any ship, not only that is owned or operated or traveling to and from an Israeli, US, or UK port, but also any ship that belongs to a company who has other ships traveling to US, UK, or Israeli ports. That's kind of everybody now, right? So if one company has a ship traveling to the Gulf of Aden or the Red Sea that is, again, maybe China to Russia, something like that, not associated with the enemies of Yemen at all, but if they have another ship somewhere, sometime that is going to the US or UK or Israel, all of a sudden all of that company's fleet becomes a viable target. You kind of blinked, and what the Houthis did here is they essentially said that any ship in the world now is a viable target, is kind of the short way around there. So it does look like they've expanded their target list quite a bit, and we've seen that reflected in the number of strikes carried out recently against commercial vessels in the area. This, again, when you're looking at some of these stats and some of these graphics put out, it's hard to line up a lot of them. You know, again, what constitutes an attack versus an attempted attack? It's pretty clear what a strike means. But we've already seen an increase in attacks just in the month of June since the Houthis put out this new information. Now, on a random side note, something I wanted to bring up just because it came up yesterday. The Houthis just unveiled what they're calling their Aden 2 hypersonic ballistic missile. I'm not a missile expert. Habitual line crosser is your guy to dig into the details on what exactly this means and how different it is or isn't from previous models. But they put out a video of them firing this. They said they launched it at a, surprise, civilian commercial vessel, the MSC Sarah V in the Arabian Sea. They said that this Aden 2 hypersonic ballistic missile has an intelligent control system, maneuverability, it's hypersonic, runs on solid fuel, has several generations with different ranges, and was made domestically in Yemen. Now, another DIA report from a couple months ago actually did a really good job of laying out a comparison side by side of Houthi munitions versus Iranian munitions to show that these are either Iranian munitions entirely or they're pieced together. Maybe they're assembled in Yemen, but they are like direct replicates of what the Iranians use. And what they rolled out in this most recent video calling the Aden 2 looks an awful lot, just looking at this graphic from the DIA, like the Iranian Khaybar Shakan, which I'm probably mispronouncing. That one, they mentioned that the Houthis had never test fired that just as of January a couple months ago. So I'm not sure if they just added a 2 to the back of it, if there's actually been any modifications, or if this is, just like the Iranian missile, they've just renamed it a little bit. Either way, that is one of the means that they're attacking these commercial and military vessels in the area. So I thought it was worth mentioning. Now, transitioning to why the United States is not conducting more offensive operations, if you will, to try to stop the Houthis from carrying out these attacks. And this is something where we don't have an exact reason. So I want to preface this by saying we're getting into opinion. I'm going to try to share 3 different opinions that I have heard, arguments that I've heard as to why the United States is not doing more. Right? It's very hard to prove we're not doing something because of, it's hard to prove a negative, right? So the first one worth getting into here is offensive operations to stop the Houthi attacks requires a lot more than just airstrikes. It would require boots on the ground occupying a portion of Yemen territory. And there's just not a lot of push to do that, right? I haven't really seen any serious arguments from anybody in the United States or really anywhere arguing that the next phase here should be an invasion of Yemen and boots on the ground to occupy the area along, the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. The reason I say that has to be done is if you look at how Yemen has been conducting this war so far, this series of attacks, they have significant underground storage and storage sites all across the country, especially the western part where the Houthis are, that they were able to withstand Saudi bombardment for years. And they're doing the same thing now when the U.S. tries to strike back and knock out significant portions of their weaponry. Even if we went after leadership and knocked out, well, that's actually better to get into the second part here, but you have to get rid of all of the drones and all of the missiles, and there's no way we're going to be able to do that from the air. You would have to put boots on the ground. That is the only real way to mitigate this threat entirely via military means. I don't think there's any stomach for that at this point. The second piece has to do with escalation with Iran. And this is tied more to, rather than just striking the military sites, what about going after some of their leadership figures, key figures, military or civilian leaders inside of the Houthi movement? An argument that I have heard there is that the Biden administration is so averse to any sort of possible escalation with Iran that they are not interested in conducting strikes in Yemen that could be perceived as some sort of escalation. So there's a little bit of a precedent for this. If you look back in February, when the U.S. carried out a pretty significant wave of attacks across Iraq and Syria, following the U.S. soldiers that were killed in a drone strike in Jordan, we telegraphed that for days, made it very, very clear what we were going to be doing, long enough time for any Iranian officers, IRGC officers in Iraq and Syria, and there are a lot of them, to exit some of those target locations and kind of move away from what was likely to be hit. Then we carried out this wave of strikes, killed a fair amount of Iraqi and Syrian militia members, but really no Iranians. And that's kind of been a theme throughout Biden's presidency at this point, is trying to avoid direct engagement with the Iranians. given the Houthi stature inside of the Iranian proxy network, it's possible that a significant strike against the Houthis, a decapitation strike, taking out their leadership, something of that nature, could be viewed as some sort of direct escalation with Iran, which, again, seems very much like something the current administration is trying to avoid. The last piece here it's even more confusing, so bear with me, but it has to do with Saudi normalization of ties with Israel. That was arguably one of the reasons why Hamas kicked off their attack on October 7th, why it happened then instead of any other time, was we were getting closer and closer to a normalization of relations between those two countries, and Hamas could not allow that to happen. Now, when looking at Yemen, again, the Saudis had been fighting the Houthis for a long time without making much progress, all things considered, and they have been trying to broker some sort of peace deal, which is very important to the Saudis. They want this war to come to an end, and there's an argument to be had here that the Saudis are asking the United States, do not engage militarily with the Houthis, just shoot down these munitions, all you want, purely defensive, no problem, but please do not escalate things on the ground, because sparking a larger war in Yemen makes it that much harder to try to secure some sort of longer-term peace deal for the ongoing Yemen civil war. And then in response to that, if the Saudis are able to achieve some sort of peace in Yemen, then the normalization with Israel is likely to move forward. Again, these are all arguments. So big picture, a strategic win for the United States, for the region, however you want to view that, right? Again, these are three different arguments I have heard as to why the United States is not striking harder at the Houthis. We, of course, do have the military capabilities. We have the capabilities in the region right outside. I mean, just look at the carriers that are there, or the new carrier coming in. The military capabilities exist in the region to do significant damage to the Houthis. We're choosing not to. And those three reasons are often what I see pointed to as to why. But that's all I got for now. Hopefully this helped to explain not just the Houthis and their attacks being carried out in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but kind of how that plays into the larger picture, not just in the Middle East, but really around the world. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.